Hello and welcome back to another video, and we're doing more, Final Fantasy stuff, obviously. And I was just kind of looking around on YouTube, as I spend most of my time doing, and this video sort of just came up, and it's the complete evolution of Dragoons by the Final Fantasy Union. Video was made a couple years ago. Link to the video and to the Final Fantasy Union channel is in the top of the description, so go check them out. And go like, oh, I haven't liked the video. I'll do that right now. I have now liked the video. And go support them. So why I'm wanting to watch this is because the first job I ever played on FF14 was a Dragoon, and I do think I might. I mean, I switched to Reaper during Endwalker, but I'm heavily considering going back to maining Dragoon as I'm now returning to the game because it's such a cool job. And then I just saw this, the complete evolution of the Dragoons, and this is not necessarily lore throughout Final Fantasy XIV. I'm sure Final Fantasy XIV will be mentioned, but it's how the Dragoon class or job has been throughout the entirety of Final Fantasies. I don't know too much about, the job actions in Final Fantasies because the Final Fantasies I played were Final Fantasy X and 15 and then 14, and that's pretty much it. So, yeah. So I don't really know much about it, so I thought this would be really interesting to look at. Before we get into the action, obviously, please do like and subscribe to this channel, and have any suggestions of things we should look at in the future, please let me know. Also, I did recently buy FF7 Remake Intergrade. Never played it before, never played FF7 before. Never played the remake, obviously. So if that's something you'd be interested in seeing me play through, let me know in the comments and we can do that on stream. But otherwise, let's look at this. Final Fantasy Union Complete Evolution of Dragoons in 3, 2, 1.
When a dangerous mythical creature surfaces, a hero of equal measure must rise to vanquish this devilish foe. And when thinking of mythical creatures, dragons are perhaps some of the most alluring and enduring. Their existence, or dragon slayers.
I think, with all of the creatures that you get in fantasy genre, or I don't know, minotaurs or hydras. I guess that kind of counts as dragons, but or I don't know, griffins or whatever. Dragon is always the top one. Anything associated with dragons is always the coolest thing in fantasy lore, from my point of view.
Ascend into popular culture, with them often playing a central role in legends and fairy tales. In earlier times, these focused around a princess who needed to be saved from a dragon.
What a film.
Venerable legends of lore like Perseus and Hercules fulfilled this role amongst their many other deeds. As time evolved, so did the role of dragons within these narratives. It saw the emergence of legendary fables such as St. George and the Dragon, and dragon slayers have featured in more recent times within the works of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yes.
Further deviations on this theme focused on a need for those to commune and work with dragons. These would become known as dragon knights or dragon riders, and they would serve as the antithesis of the dragon slayer. But before we go further, delving into the role dragon knights have played within Final Fantasy, it's time for a message from our sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends. Set in a world ravaged by war, Raid Shadow Legends is free to play on both
while
mobile
this is playing,
and desktop,
I'll let it play as
it's,
it's their video, it's their sponsor.
Lord Cyril. To undertake this quest,
has anyone
brave
actually ever played Raid Shadow Legends? Because it's just, I know it as a meme.
150 champions that hail from a multitude.
I don't know if it's actually any good.
They can each be summoned by crystals.
I know it's a mobile game,
and
so
every champion comes with a wide range of special abilities.
Yeah,
and you can check out reviews from other players to see where they're most useful. If you sign up now, the daily reward program has been doubled from 90 to 180 days for new players.
Daily rewards.
Each day, you can claim your free rewards, from energy refills, silver and gems, to shards, and even a free barbarian legendary champion, Chill of the Drake. So far, I've been having fun delving into the story mode, seeking riches in dungeons, and challenging myself against other players in the PvE arena.
Great.
So what are you waiting for? Go to the video description, check out our special Final Fantasy Union link, and you will get 100,000 silver, 2 clan boss keys, 10 mystery shards, and a free awesome champion, the Executioner.
Wow,
this package will only be available for the next 30 days, so good luck, and we'll see you out there. Now, given its fantasy origins, In its earlier days, Final Fantasy lent heavily on established classes and icons within the fantasy genre's canon. Within the original game, this saw the inclusion of 6 core jobs.
So what we've got there? So Black Mage, White Mage, Paladin and Ninja?
Relating to basic magic and combat prowess. Maybe? But as the franchise built out, the jobs started to become a bit more elaborate. And one of the jobs that's always stirred the imagination is the Dragoon, a knight clad in dragon-themed armor who leaps into the sky.
How could you not watch the Heavensward trailer and not want to play a Dragoon?
To strike their foes with a lance.
Just look at that.
The image of Cain Highwind in the logo of Final Fantasy IV serves to immortalize this legacy. But even though this particular class of warriors has been with the franchise almost since the beginning, and they have continued to be a mainstay featuring in almost every major Final Fantasy release in some shape or form, what's interesting is that many of the hallmarks you'd expect to find from a Dragoon weren't established until after its initial introduction. But that's not to say Final Fantasy II's Dragoon didn't leave a lasting impression. Richard Highwind was the last guest character to join Firian's party before Leon took his rightful place as the 4th permanent member. We learnt that Richard was the last in a long line of Dragon Knights who hailed from the small kingdom of Deist, the home of wyverns. And it was here that they formed bonds with the native creatures and were told that they rode them into battle. But due to the heinous acts of the Empire, the entire island was decimated before the game began. Richard lived on as the sole survivor as he was swallowed alive by Leviathan while seeking the Ultimate Home. But when he gave his life so that his friends could escape the Dark Emperor, the Dragoons died with him. Even though his appearance was brief, Richard, despite fighting from the skies, had a natural affinity with swords and wore armor typical of a standard foot knight. But the debut appearance of Richard, despite not having many of the iconic features, did still help to establish many elements that were carried forward as the franchise built out. Even if Final Fantasy III, due to its shift in narrative style, ignored most of them. With no named characters, Final Fantasy III reverted back to a focused group of nameless warriors of light. On their adventure, they would acquire various jobs from crystals that would aid them in their quest, and it was within the third...
So that's why that's carried over, you get your job crystal, because it was like that in Final Fantasy III. Interesting.
Batch of jobs, which were obtained from the water crystal, that players could unlock the power of Dragoons.
Water crystal.
It meant there was no full backstory that connected anything with dragons, but given the specific focus on gameplay, Final Fantasy III was used to flesh out and cement many elements that would become staples of the Dragoon class for many years to come. And this was because Final Fantasy III introduced the idea of command abilities. These allowed each job to perform 4 different actions, and although many were the same across each of the jobs, some were unique. In the case of Dragoon, the 4 commands were fight, defend, item, and jump.
Oh, look at that. Play free. Haven't you heard of the critically acclaimed?
This brand new ability allowed Dragoons to literally leap off the screen for one turn and deal double damage to the target when they returned.
Oh, double
While they
damage.
were off screen, they could not be affected by anything.
It's like Fly in Pokemon.
Meaning they dodged attacks automatically, but also missed out on the opportunities to be healed or buffed. What was impressive was that Dragoons were able to perform this acrobatic feat while wearing heavy armor, and this was where we saw our first evolution, as the heavy armor gained a dragon-esque aesthetic thanks to a winged helm, even though it was quite hard to see. As part of their overall appearance, Dragoons also gained a new passive ability, a damage boost when using jump against dragons.
So sick, man.
This was no doubt due to their intimate knowledge of the creatures, and it meant that even though there was no lore with relation to dragons, it helped to build out a fuller picture of what the job was capable of. It was also decided within Final Fantasy III that they would scrap the affinity with swords and opt instead for spears, much more logical given the piercing nature of their attacks.
True.
When combined with what was established in Final Fantasy II, the new and evolved mechanics within Final Fantasy III provided a more complete framework that could be pulled from, and when Final Fantasy IV then arrived, everything was pulled together to create what is now considered the quintessential Dragoon, Cain Highwind. It was a
I don't know who this guy is, I assume he's very well
breakthrough appearance for the job class, as Final Fantasy IV solidified Dragoons in the Final Fantasy canon, but even though it must have felt like a revolution at the time, everything within Final Fantasy IV was based more around refinement than anything else. Cain was introduced in the game's opening scenes as the best friend of the protagonist, Cecil Harvey, and his backstory had significant
he looks so cool though, look at that.
Similarities to his namesake, Richard. Dragoons were on the verge of being disbanded.
Very small spear. Very small. I wonder if it extends.
After the death of Kane's father, we learnt that in the past, dragoons were trained in Baron, and they formed bonds with dragons, which they rode into combat. But following the advent of airships...
And this is one reason why well, there's several reasons why I'm super excited for FF16, is firstly, it returns to a medieval setting, like, obviously, these games, FF4, I guess, and obviously FF14. And also, there's a Dragoon in that. If you watch the gameplay trailer, there you fight a Dragoon, which is really, really cool. I'm really looking forward to seeing how they fit in into FF16. And I'm also wondering if any other obvious jobs appear in FF16 as well. I assume there will be.
The usage had become redundant. Dragoons were relegated to sentries, and by the time Kane was old enough to choose a profession, wyverns had all but become extinct. Still, Kane resolved to become...
Come on, man, look at that. Incredible.
Dragoon despite these obstacles as a tribute to his father, and it served as a nod to the sole survivor trait. Kane then rebuilt the Dragoons later on to complete this particular story arc. Building on Final Fantasy III, Kane had a natural affinity with spears, but this time he was the only character in the game that could equip that particular weapon class. He could also use the jump ability, but unlike in Final Fantasy III, he could only do so when wielding a spear, and his damage boost against dragons was only realised if he equipped a specific weapon, the Wyvern Lance. Kane's designation as a Dragoon was also made much more obvious due to his legendary set of armour, and all these elements, when combined with his central role within the game's narrative, helped Kane to become a very memorable character who would inspire the creation of future Dragoons like no other. As with Final Fantasy III, Final Fantasy V's job system took away the cultural and personal influences of the Dragoons. The closest thing we got to a Dragoon character was actually Gilgamesh, as the famous antagonist used jump throughout his different boss battles, despite being more of a samurai. Dragoons were unlocked late into the game, this time in the fourth batch of jobs from the Earth Crystal, and Bartz's armour had a strong resemblance to Kane's. They again had a weapon affinity with spears, but could also use knives, and like in Final Fantasy III, jump would do more damage if a spear was equipped. They could also receive a damage boost against dragons, and this was similar to Final Fantasy IV, as it would only be granted if the Dragon Lance was equipped. Jump was also available for using the Dragoon job class, but because abilities could be permanently learnt within Final Fantasy V, it became a signature ability as opposed to a unique one. And this led to an evolution, as jump could be combined with other classes' abilities for extra potency and utility, such as Spellblade, an offensive ability associated with Mystic Knights. Final Fantasy V also introduced a second signature ability called Lancet. This allowed HP and MP to be absorbed from an enemy, combining Drain and Osmose into one ability, albeit with less effectiveness. Despite adding a few new elements, it meant Final Fantasy V Dragoon was very familiar to what had been seen within the two previous installments. But then there was a dramatic shift, as Final Fantasy VI did not include Dragoons at all.
No, what? I guess that's fair enough. I mean, I've heard a lot about FF6. I know it's a lot of people's favourites. I wonder... I mean, I could play it, I suppose, but I do wonder if they'll ever remake it like they did with 7.
That's not to say there weren't illusions, though. Acting as a subversion, jump could now be accessed by equipping the Dragoon Boots relic. This would give any character access to the command without having to learn anything or equipping a certain job. But what's interesting is that Edgar and Mog both had an affinity with spears, and if either of them equipped the Dragoon Boots, while also wielding a spear that wasn't amongst their strongest, then their jumps would deal double damage. Similar to Final Fantasy V, jump could also be combined with auto-cast spells to deal extra damage, and there was also a new trait introduced. When combined with the Dragon Horn relic, jump could be upgraded to have multiple hits. So despite Final Fantasy VI being a significant regression for Dragoons, through the inclusion of jump, quite a few traits witnessed from Final Fantasy III through V were still present, and there was even an expansion of the class that future games would reference. Final Fantasy VII saw something of a return for Dragoons via Cid Highwind, the grumpy and cantankerous mechanic. There was no noble backstory relating to dragons or how he came to learn his unique fighting style, but many of the gameplay hallmarks were there, they just weren't front and centre. Cid had an affinity with spears, but due to the changed gameplay system, each character did not have any unique abilities by default outside of their limit breaks. And this is where we got to see the major connection between Cid and his Dragoon forefathers, as 3 of his 7 limit breaks were variants of the jump technique.
It's weird to think
served
of a
as both
seed
a
as a
subversion
dragoon
and an evolution,
the games I've
as
played.
jump was not accessible as a standard command for the first time,
Cigarette in his
but
mouth.
it was also the first time that significant variations of jump were available. The limit break dragon also served to give dragoons a new trait while subverting another. Within the wider lore, we had always known about the connection dragoons had with dragons, but none of them had ever fought alongside them in literal terms. We just heard about it through hearsay. Cid Highwind bucked this trend, as for this particular limit break, he summoned a dragon to attack his foes, while also healing his HP and MP in the process, acting as a subversion of Lancet. It meant that while Final Fantasy VI served as a regression, Final Fantasy VII was an example of how dragoons were being adapted to the new vision of Final Fantasy, and many of the offline dragoons that followed would receive similar treatment. Ward Zabak, for example, borrowed elements seen within Final Fantasy VII to display a rather unorthodox implementation of dragoons when he appeared within Final Fantasy VIII as Laguna's companion. At first glance, Ward has a unique fighting style unlike any prior dragoon. Instead of slashing or thrusting with his spear or lance, he instead threw an enormous harpoon at foes before running to retrieve it. This acted as a subversion of the weapon affinity trait, as harpoons are still, of course, a rather specific type of spear. Ward then borrowed from Cid Highwind, as he had access to jump, but only within his limit break, Massive Anchor. This saw Ward throw his weapon into the air before riding it back down to the ground. It was short and sweet, but it set the stage for Final Fantasy IX, where the implementation of dragoons was a thorough combination of everything that had been seen within almost every previous Final Fantasy game. Freya Crescent was presented as an elite warrior who hailed from Burmecia, the spiritual home of Dragon Knights. But similar to Final Fantasy II and IV, their numbers were decimated within the narrative, and along with Sir Fratley and a few others, Freya was one of only a handful of survivors who retained skills as a Dragon Knight. This unique fighting style contained almost every major hallmark. Freya had an affinity with spears, and her special ability was jump. Freya could then enhance jump's effectiveness by learning her passive high jump ability, and she could also learn the Dragon Killer passive via her dragon armor, which allowed her to deal 50% more damage to this type of enemy. Freya also evolved what was seen within Final Fantasy VII and VIII, as the damage output of her jump ability could be boosted while she was in trance. In addition, type of enemy. Freya also evolved.
Is that what race is Freya? I can't tell.
Was seen within Final Fantasy VII and VIII, as the damage output of her jump ability could be boosted while she was in trance.
Bam!
In addition, Freya had a unique skill set called Dragon. This allowed her to use a much wider range of abilities. Or was that just like a mask or something? Something new for the class. It also allowed her to fulfill something of a hybrid role, with Red Mage acting as something akin to a sub-job. It was within this skill set that Lancet could be found, but Freya also had a move no other prior dragoon had access to, Dragon Breath. Freya was also given dragon-themed attire, which helped her to stand out against her Dragon Knight contemporaries, and this rounded out her implementation quite well.
She is a different race. She doesn't... Look at the feet. She doesn't look like a Makote or anything like that. That's already in FF14.
Well, in fact, the only traits Freya didn't exhibit that were previously seen in a prior dragoon were the literal association with dragons and any nod to the name Highwind. It was very thorough and fitting, considering what the developers were looking to achieve with Final Fantasy IX, and some of what was introduced was then carried forth to Final Fantasy X. As with Final Fantasy VI, VII, and VIII, there was no literal dragoon in a narrative sense, but Kimahri Ronso ticked many of the boxes despite not looking or acting the part. Kimahri had a natural affinity with spears.
Yeah, obviously I do remember this, and I do remember his jumps and stuff, but I don't recall dragoon being mentioned in FF10. It's been many, many years since I've played it. But yeah, I guess it's interesting to see how, they were, for a lot of the games, slightly later on, apart from up to maybe from 5 onwards, the jobs are still very much there. They just were concealed. Because you can see in the bottom corner there's Lulu, who I believe is a black mage.
One of his core abilities was Lancet. As seen in previous games, this allowed him to absorb HP and MP, but its utility was also evolved, as casting Lancet on specific enemies would allow him to learn abilities that could then be used within Ronso Rage, his limit break. And it was within Kimahri's limit break that jump could be found, just like in Final Fantasy 7 and 8. Ronso Rage also gave Kimahri a hybrid role, much like Freya within Final Fantasy 9, due to its strong association with the Blue Mage job. Kimahri lacked any association with dragons, but his story arc did touch upon what might be expected from Dragoons. The Ronso learn and hone their abilities at their spiritual home, Mount Gargazet, and due to what happens within the narrative, much of Kimahri's tribe was eradicated, making him one of the few warriors to survive. It served as another unorthodox implementation of Dragoons, but as we ventured into the realm of MMOs and the developers were looking to use nostalgia to their advantage, we got to see by far the most refined adaptation of Dragoons in the history of the franchise. For the first time since Final Fantasy V, Dragoon appeared as an official job. They weren't included within the base game, only arriving alongside Rise of Zealot, but when they did, they were steeped in lore that went much deeper than anything we'd seen within the game.
Alright, here we go.
To become a Dragoon, a pact needed to be made with a living wyvern, and in times past, Dragoons hailed from their spiritual home of Sandoria. But after King Rampere's top vassal perished at the hands of a dragon slayer, it was believed no more Dragoons existed in the land, and that it would become near impossible for anyone to become one, as dragon slayers had set about hunting and killing all the remaining wyverns.
I see.
Needless to say, becoming a Dragoon was still possible, and their gameplay mechanics were much more detailed than anything we'd seen before. As expected, Dragoons had an affinity with spears, and jump was their special ability. As with Final Fantasy IX, the utility of jump could be boosted using the high jump ability. When using Spirit Surge, jump could also be enhanced to drain HP, making it a subversion of Lancet. Final Fantasy XI also combined traits from Final Fantasy VII and IX, as Dragoons could use various types of jump, such as Super Jump and Spirit Jump, but they were now standard abilities as opposed to being held within limit breaks. This then worked in with the capacity for Final Fantasy XI's Dragoons to use a wide range of abilities, and perhaps the most unique was Call Wyvern. Evolving what was seen within Final Fantasy VII, this allowed Dragoons to fight alongside a dragon, as they appeared as a commandable pet with their own stats and moves.
That's really cool. I'm not sure. Yeah, I guess it's kind of odd to when you come from FF14 where Dragoons were... The job of a Dragoon is to kill and defend against dragon attacks. So to know that kind of the Dragoons, what it sounds like in FF11, were kind of there to protect and what's the phrase? Like conserve them, I guess, and use them as pets and stuff. That's very, very interesting. Very interesting.
Dragoons also received a damage boost when fighting against dragons thanks to their Dragon Killer trait, and this was evolved compared to what we had seen before thanks to the inclusion of a second tier of bonus. There was also a new trait included, as thanks to the Ancient Circle ability, Dragoons could also boost the defense of their party against dragons. And of course, they could equip the AF armor that had a strong resemblance to what Kain had worn many, many years prior. It was due to this faithful and expansive implementation that many, many people still wanted to play as Dragoons, persevering even though their actual application as a DPS class was quite poor, and they had a pretty bad reputation within the game's meta for a long time.
Oh, well, I feel that. That has carried on.
But while Final Fantasy XI was the most comprehensive implementation of Dragoons we'd ever seen, Final Fantasy XII was the most limited. Due to the license board, there was no room for any weapon specialisms, and despite the array of techniques being quite expansive, there were no Dragoon abilities made available for the playable cast. Instead, the only illusion we got to Dragoons came through enemies, as Bangar used the jump technique and Bagamnan used high jump during his first boss encounter. Final Fantasy XIII was then a bit more inclusive, as Fang featured a handful of traits often associated with Dragoons. She had a weapon affinity with spears, and her signature attack, called High Wind, saw her jump into the air before performing a devilish dive, much like the classic jump ability. Even though there was no association with dragons, an aspect of Fang's backstory did resonate with Dragoons, as alongside Vanille, she was one of the only remaining survivors from the Urba clan following the War of Transgression.
Damn.
And then there was Final Fantasy XIV, which saw Dragoons promoted to a starring role following the release of Heavensward.
Woo!
Unlike Final Fantasy XI, Dragoons were featured within the base game, but for the first time, the job was more akin to an upgrade, and that's because it could only be obtained after Lancer reached level 30. True to form, Dragoons wore aesthetically consistent armor, and the AF armor has been upgraded with each expansion. They also had an affinity with spears, and jump was the first accessible ability. Within their wide range of abilities, there were also many derivatives of jump, and one of these, called Mirage Dive, could be boosted when used in conjunction with Blood of the Dragon. Within the game's lore, Dragoons hail from Ishgard and are said to
Ishgard is probably my favourite zone, or favourite city in the game.
Be one of the things that are most symbolic of the nation. It meant that, unlike many other games where Dragoons were in short supply, within Final Fantasy XIV, they were somewhat plentiful. There was an evolution, though, thanks to the Azure Dragoon.
The Azure Dragoon. They did a great job with introducing the Azure Dragoon. And if I don't know if any of you played through Heaven's Ward as a Dragoon, the interactions that you have with Estinian is really interesting, especially at the start, as he's kind of like sort of your nemesis in the end of A Realm Reborn. And then he turned into being probably one of, if not my favorite, one of, if not my favorite character in the game.
Plot device, which saw one person given a prominent position within the military. Instead of being the sole survivor, this saw one Dragoon elevated above all others. This particular role also housed a connection with dragons themselves, as often those who wielded the Eyes of Nidhogg, a legendary dragon, would be ordained as the Azure Dragoon. It meant that while Final Fantasy XIV's implementation was perhaps not as comprehensive in terms of the...
What's this? What is that timer in the bottom? What was this? 1.0? I can't... No, it's not. Oh, this is like Stormblood? Because it's level 70?
Due to their prominence, it was a fine entry, even adding to the wider lore. And the same could also be said about Final Fantasy XV, which saw Dragoons given a prominent role within the game's supporting cast via Aranea Highwind.
I didn't even know
Outside of
that.
her rather fitting name...
I played FF15 before I played FF14 properly, so I didn't even really kind of catch on to that at all.
Aranea had an affinity with spears, and like Fang, had a signature move that was called Highwind.
Whoa.
This saw Aranea jump into the air before diving and slamming her lance into the ground.
Amazing.
Within the game's lore, Aranea also ticked the sole survivor trait. After her village was destroyed by demons, Aranea was forced to seek shelter with other children, but was refused permission to fight. As the years went on, she developed her unique Dragoon fighting style, which was unlike anything ever seen throughout Eos. As she built her reputation as a mercenary, Aranea was then given custom dragon-scale armor by the Empire to reflect her standing. There were also allusions to Dragoons outside of Aranea, as elements crept into the fighting styles of Noctis and Ignis.
Yeah.
Noctis has access to a move akin to jump when performing a downward strike, and Ignis can also perform high jump. In addition, Ignis also has access to Lancet, but as we had seen within a couple of the more recent installments, it was a subversion as it only drained HP, not MP. Either way, it was a pretty decent showing for Dragoons, and it will be interesting to see what future installments do with the venerable class, especially as Square Enix has often tried their hardest to enhance appearances within re-releases and sequels. For example, in subsequent releases of Final Fantasy II, Richard had his appearance changed to match that of Kain, giving him a much stronger visual association with Dragoons. He also had his weapon affinity changed from swords to spears, and his newly adopted son was given the name Kain, acting as an Easter egg with Final Fantasy IV. And on the subject of Final Fantasy IV, 17 years after its release, the After Years would introduce the Holy Dragoon as an evolved job class. Just like the Paladin as a knight who can use healing magic and holy elemental attacks, the Holy Dragoon is a Dragoon who can use healing magic and holy elemental.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. An enhanced job class. I reacted to a kind of FF14 mod video of a Necromancer Summoner, and I did ask him that. An enhanced job class is actually a really good way of putting it. What would people think of having enhanced, like in the next, I don't know, probably not the next expansion, but maybe the one afterwards, instead of adding more jobs, having enhanced jobs. So kind of like where you go from your class to your job to an enhanced job. Seems complicated, very complicated, probably too complicated to actually happen, but it is fun to speculate. Holy Dragoon, very interesting.
Elemental attacks. So far, this has remained exclusive to Kain. The lack of Dragoon in Final Fantasy XII was then amended for the release of the Zodiac Age, as Allhan appeared as a subversive class. They had an affinity with spears, but due to the nature of their source, the ability to jump was omitted from their arsenal on purpose. The real apology for the omission of Dragoons, though, came within Revenant Wings. Here, thanks to Lud and the addition of the Aegil, we got to see a pretty faithful implementation of the classic job class. Lud had a weapon affinity with spears, and his two unique abilities were Jump and Lancet, which performed as expected. Within the game's lore, Lud, along with the other Aegil, were Dragoons by trade, and they hailed from their spiritual home of Lemures.
Wow.
Lightning Returns also feature Dragoons in a more obvious sense thanks to an aptly named garb called the Dragoon Garb.
Ooh.
It gave Lightning the quintessential visual appearance and allowed her to use a subverted version of Lancet, really cool. But outside of that, its application was limited in relation to other Dragoon traits. Dragoons have also featured within numerous spin-off titles, but their appearances have often served as tributes as opposed to standalone offerings that built upon anything that was established. Within Final Fantasy Tactics, Dragoons could be accessed after leveling Thief to level 4. They wore dragon-themed armor, had an affinity with spears, and their special ability was Jump, making them quite useful. It wasn't until Final Fantasy Tactics Advance and its sequel that things expanded a little bit further, as for the first time, the Dragoon job was exclusive to a race, the Bangar. They had access to Jump, Lancet, and various breath abilities, and had a bonus when fighting against dragons. They could also wield swords and spears, but Jump's bonus damage only applied to spears. Final Fantasy Type 0 featured an allusion to Dragoons thanks to 9, and Final Fantasy Explorers was par for the course. This job had an affinity with spears, and they also had access to Jump and Lancet. Record Keeper, Brave Exvius, and Mobius Dragoons also had basic implementations that focused around what was expected, and even though Final Fantasy Dimensions did show a bit of deviation as Dragoons had access to breath abilities, within the wider franchise, the implementation of Dragoons has often felt like it was more done for the sake of vanity and nostalgia than anything of substance.
I see.
Nonetheless, it's been very interesting to dive into this particular topic, as it shows that even though Dragoons may not have been present in the literal sense, the developers have often tried their hardest to include allusions to the Fable class
pretty much everywhere, haven't they?
Hopefully you guys have found this study interesting. If you have, then please do consider hitting that like button.
Link in the description.
Subscribing to the channel if you have not done so already. And if you have the time, let us know in the comments which has been your favourite Dragoon so far and which job you'd like us to take a look at next. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video.
Alright, I'll stop that there then. Yeah, cool. Great video, as expected. But I guess like what I'll discuss briefly now is like, yeah, how Dragoons have kind of always been featured in some way, bar a couple of games. They're always somewhat there. There's or at least tributed to, which I guess shows how deep they are within the lore of Final Fantasy generally. What was I going to say? And it does make me wonder, because a lot of the single-player games that they mention kind of have Dragoons there, or they have a Dragoon aesthetics, but there isn't a lot of lore to that. I wonder how that'll be tackled in FF16, because it looks a lot like a lot deeper, and I think in the trailer, if I remember rightly, they said that they were attacked by one of someone's Dragoons or something like that. So they're obviously a type of, I don't know, enemy in the game, or maybe you can play as one, or maybe you can upgrade into one or something like that. That would be very, very interesting to see how that happens, particularly as that game is kind of, you know, creative directed by, or being looked after or overseen by Yoshida, who has obviously put a lot of thought into Dragoons in FF14. So that'll be very, very interesting to see how that works. But anyway, yeah, I think we could probably leave the video there, as I'll just probably be rambling on. But that was very good. So please do go click the link in the description and like this video and follow Final Fantasy Union. Really informative and very interesting. But anyway, I'll leave the video here. So thank you all so much for watching. Please do subscribe to this channel. Suggestions for stuff to look at in the comments below. And do like the video as well, because it helps the channel out a ton. Thank you all so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.